Matters of Fact, Facing Our Past. Tom Wegener, a German radio journalist, and Wolfram Hartmann, a Namibian Africanist historian, talk on important aspects of Namibia's controversial and painful colonial past. The aim is to facilitate a conversation, to disseminate knowledge and to infuse current debates with a sense of reconciliation, respectfully, evidence-based and soundly researched, reasonably and without one-upmanship or virtue signaling, for Namibians in Namibia, from Namibia.
While not skirting controversy and, as said, not engaging in moral grandstanding, our intention is to correlate popular and academic knowledge. The aim is to facilitate a genuine reckoning with Namibia's sore past and to challenge, in an enriching way, some of our often divisive perspectives, at the same time being cognizant of the complexity of Namibian history. Our point of departure is that colonialism was and remains a crime against humanity, somehow better captured in the all-encompassing German word Menschheitsverbrechen.
Before we continue with our episode as planned, I want to address an issue that cropped up in some of the feedback to our first episode on the OvaHerero War. I picked up on two kinds of uneasiness about the historian's stance in describing the events of 1904, and as interrogated by you, Tom.
Oh, this is taking us into a direction not assumed, but let's see. It feels as if our work spawns closer questions, curiosity, new perspectives even, on this defining event in the history of Namibia. Will there be even some conciliatory aspect, I might ask? Hope even? Anyway, on second thought, isn't this just what we wanted?
Sure, this is what we wanted. I'm quite chuffed by being challenged this way. Well, only partly. Let me describe what I picked up and sensed feedback-wise. I sensed an uneasiness about my academic, scholarly stance, assumed to be a neutrality by some listeners. I repeat, by some of our listeners. To qualify, it is understood that this neutrality does not do justice to the topic. Events which, after all, developed into the most horrendous historical event that befell OvaHerero during German colonial times, and Nama for that sake. We will deal with that in due course.
On to the second aspect of our listeners' objections then.
Yes, Tom. On the same count, and in this case not politely phrased, and less welcomed by me, because of its dearth of even a modicum of intellectual curiosity, others questioned our role. Some denouncing loudly what we were doing here as unwarranted siding with OvaHerero, as if this was an accusation, really. I'd say, rather a badge of honor, don't you agree?
Yes, Wolfram, indeed, I agree.
Let me provisionally respond. Yes, our stance should even be understood to be kind of detached. It can cause pain, mostly to those of OvaHerero origin. But we are siding with the colonized in this case unequivocally.
To reinforce this, rest assured, we are partial to the OvaHereros and the Nama's cause without doubt. Yet, some may ask why two German speakers engage with this on this level?
Some clarification then. As a scholarly oriented Namibian and historian, my first and foremost, even noble task is to present history in a fact-based way. Keeping to facts will, of course, sometimes dig up inconvenient aspects. That is why being a historian in Namibia is, at times, very unpleasant.
Well, let's see how that goes.
One has to add to this, secondly, that honor-bound historical work refrains from judging, from being morally outraged, yes, from expressing an emotionally charged sentiment when retelling such history. To which I must add, an intellectual activist of my sort cannot retain this kind of detachment at all times. Too gruesome, abhorrent, awful, and insufferable is what a historian of this era is dealing with. But, true to methodological concerns, an appreciation appraisal, an opinion can only be meaningfully formed once the story is told, once the interested audience has been exposed to the facts as they become available.
Yes, Wolfram, it sounds understandable even though ambivalent. Isn't this what we call a dilemma?
A dilemma? Ambivalent? I don't think so. Maybe at face value, but certainly not if thought through thoroughly. Facts and emotions do not contradict each other here. It is just more adequate to first look in a detached way at the facts and then be outraged. For now, and for our purposes, we are primarily concerned with the factious side of things and understand that to be a prerequisite for informed action, then carried, of course, by outrage. Something in this line?
I get it, Wolfram, but is there a particular reason why you emphasize this point so much?
Yes. As an activist historian, I have to make sure that what I say stands up to close scrutiny. Therefore, I would like to frame the issue differently. Doing fact-based, evidence-based history means confronting oneself, being confronted with the horrendous nature of colonialism, the atrocities committed by the colonizer. Also, one learns inadvertently about the extensive effort to disown this history, the blanket denial of this by the colonizers and their descendants, about the energy that goes into the fabrication of arguments and fakeries, and, this is as important, about the quite horrendous dealings among indigenous Namibian communities in the pre-colonial, even in the colonial period.
Oh my gosh, Wolfram, aren't you now opening a Pandora's box of issues? One that maybe could be the topic of yet another series of podcasts?
Tom, you're right. Let me finish this train of thought, therefore. Fact-asserted knowledge, which is cerebral in nature, brain-oriented, intellectual knowledge stands against emotional knowledge. Cardial wisdom. Wisdom of the heart, a legitimate wealth of knowledge, worthy in its own right. Problematic is that this knowledge is almost entirely based on orally transmitted lore, and lore is problematic as a source for a scholarly historian. But, again, this is a topic that we shall address separately elsewhere.
Indeed, I now start to understand the enormity of this topic and its importance in the pursuit of Namibian history. We should move on though, methinks.
One last important aspect though. I have, over the course of my academic career, only very occasionally come across some Namibians who had really engaged seriously, thoroughly and with conviction with the existing research literature. I concede, however, there were quite some who had digested this history through the consumption of the widely available, rather biased German colonial material, yet not at all with the available scholarly tools and analysis. The stress in this last utterance of mine is on the word biased. I repeat, without intending to sound vindictive, I still feel this should be added here. Everybody seemingly knows what happened, yet almost nobody really does. And while it surely is less important to be knowledgeable in detail in light of what happened, an evidence-grounded knowledge of the chronology of events and developments will enable a more constructive way of talking, of being with each other, which is still difficult even though what we talk about here happened 120 and more years ago, and are not belittling what happened since then, and because of them. This is enormously important.
I see, Wolfram. I think you have now made this point succinctly clear and as thoroughly as possible. Yet, thinking of our more chronology-minded listeners, let us move on with a retelling of the events as they unfolded as from mid-January 1904.
Sure, Tom. That's what we have set out to do after all, isn't it? I'm taking my cue from my last podcast. The war started with an attack on Okahandja. This settlement had developed into the most important abode of the Maharero chieftaincy in those years under Samuel Maharero. It was also a very important mission station of the Rhenish Mission Society, with a large church even. Several of the large merchants, for instance Wegener and Horst, had established agencies and warehouses. Samuel Maharero himself stayed in a large European-style house. Okahandja was connected by a railway line to Windhoek, the administrative capital, and to Swakopmund, the colony's main harbour.
Wait a minute, Wolfram. Just a little sentence on your sources for this knowledge, please.
Yes, Tom. An important question warranting a considered answer, and one that we touched on already in our earlier podcasting work. Yet, could I suggest we deal with this issue in a later episode of this series, affording it the weight it deserves? This is not a one-off issue.
Okay. Just make sure we absolutely deal with this at some time.
Sure, Tom. Well, where was I? Oh yeah, Okahanda. Conspicuous developments among OvaHerero had been observed by missionaries and colonial officials all over the colony in the weeks prior to the outbreak of the conflict, but had not been taken for what they were, warning signs, and only resulting in most lackadaisical, half-hearted precautionary measures by the military and civil authorities. The Germans were, therefore, taken by almost complete surprise at the outbreak of hostilities. Except for Okahanda, where a modicum of preparations for this eventuality resulted in more readiness for an expected attack.
Wait a minute, Wolfram. I recall us talking about the fact of the Germans' military absence from central OvaHerero land during the weeks as from late December 1903. Can you elaborate?
Well, we'll come to that in a second. OvaHerero targeted, aside from the more vulnerable settlements, mainly settlers and traders in an area very roughly outlined from Okahanda along the railway to Karibib and northwards to Okombahe, Omaruru, and through Kaondeka into Omaheke and back to Windhoek. Whereas the settlements were relatively safe, settlers and traders in the countryside had no real chance to survive, and the bloodletting was almost total with 124 Europeans. 119 men, 4 women and 1 child succumbing to this violence. Homesteads were vandalized, looting, burning, the spoils being weapons, ammunition, food, and very important, the herds. Importantly, the few communication lines, the telegraph lines on the railway lines were cut and destroyed.
Oh, does not sound good. Violence exploding, unleashed. But very obviously a mirror image of, a reflection on what had been meted out to OvaHerero by Germans. But sorry, I interrupted the flow of your narrative.
Yes, sure. I can hear how speechless you are with horror at what transpired. But let me comment, this is the nature of colonialism. This is what results from, this is the aftermath of colonial conquest, expropriation. He who sows the wind shall reap the whirlwind. Wer den Wind sät, erntet den Sturm, is what the Bible has to say. This would develop into the longest, costliest, and possibly the most brutal war in the history of German colonialism.
Wolfram, let us get back to Okahanda.
Yes, Okahanda. It was clear that something untoward was brewing. The remaining spare troops were mobilized. The settlement...
Wait a minute, this is where you can talk about the absence of the military from central OvaHerero land. I tried to lure you into talking about this earlier.
Yes, I'm aware. Even then this interrupts the narrative again. Too many important aspects cropping up. OvaHerero had obviously chosen as propitious the situation where no German forces were present in central OvaHerero land. Leutwein, the imperial governor, had ordered the Schutztruppe forces to the south, as he deemed it necessary to impress upon Bundeswärts the power of the German colonial military.
Are you saying the Nama war had started then already?
No, I'm not saying that. Although there's a debate about this. Let us deal with this when we deal with that war, and whether it can be meaningfully even separated from the war we are dealing with right now.
Oh man, this is complicated, and the more I hear, the more I'm confused, Wolfram.
Yes, Tom, no easy feat. A complicated history in need of some differentiation. Let me get back to what I was saying, explaining something about German military culture. Germany, the colonizing power, was amongst the most powerful military nations in the world, definitely more than just proverbial. As such, their pervasive military culture and structures had been installed to quite some degree in the colony as well. Every German male citizen in the colony was, therefore, conscripted in some or other capacity as a part of the German military. Civilians who had served their compulsory military service were kept enlisted for call-up in what was then called the Reserve, or the Landsturm in German Southwest Africa.
Yes, you are right. We often forget the high degree of this most elaborate German military organization. Really proverbial in this case, and that this also had some decisive bearing on the situation on the colonies. It would actually take the combined forces of France, the UK, Russia, Italy, the USA, Greece and Turkey to subdue this German military some 14 years later in the First World War.
Yes, Tom. This is an important aspect to be included in a discussion of the subject. Let me get back to where I was. When Leutwein had moved the regular troops to the south, as mentioned just a moment ago, these reserve contingents had been mobilized and were available for military purposes. Many men were therefore in the barracks in January, which, as an aside, saved their lives. And they defended what was to be defended, while the regular troops were not around for this purpose. In addition to this, the Germans had immense amounts of provisions in terms of food, uniforms, transport, stuff, and weaponry, ammunition, stored and employed in their barracks. In short, a most well-prepared adversary, one that strived to be ready at all times. We'll talk about this again in the course of our podcasting.
Now, speaking of which, I have not really heard anything about a formal declaration of war on either side. Is that maybe part of, well, how should I say this, an African way of warfare? Also, is there an explanation for the discrepancy in the numbers of casualties? Many men, very few women, one child?
Oh, Tom, you're constantly opening cans of worms with your questions. But, again, this is what these podcasts are all about. Raising all sorts of questions, trying to find answers. Indeed, there's no documented real declaration of war delivered by a diplomatic envoy to the headquarters of the enemy. But we have an indirect pointer to something in the line of an order to start this war, issued by Samuel Maharero.
Sounds interesting. Give it a go.
A decree issued by Omohona Munene Samuel Maharero at the beginning of the war, it is actually dated 11 January 1904, stipulates how the war is to be conducted. In it he addressed who should be spared by his warriors: the English, Baster, Damara, Nama, and the Boers. Also, the Ovahonga, the missionaries, were somehow equivocally not to be told about this. The original wording in OvaHerero can be found on the start screen of this release. This order for containment of martial violence implies a declaration of war. Yet, a written document to this effect has not been found in any archival holdings.
Wolfram, this is remarkable, really. It, in a way, can change the narrative about this history, but completely so. Please continue.
Let me finish my train of thought on this issue. We then look at the number of casualties, many men, a few women, one child. That needs to be explained as well, aside from the fact that during those years few colonizing settlers were accompanied by any spouses, and even less children had been born out of these relations. We also have enough information to argue that OvaHerero did everything to spare women and children. There's evidence which proves the point that OvaHerero deliberately ensured the latter's survival. They supplied them with the means to survive, for instance with cows for milk for the children, but also instructed them in no uncertain times to move off to Swakopmund speedily to get a ship to take them home to Deutschland, to Germany. Those women who perished, they died because they were trying to shield their husbands.
Wait a second. Somehow something is missing here. These spouses were European women, and very few? Men are said to need sex. Please explain.
Okay. One last digression, rather clarification. Yes, there's this whole issue of sexual relations between colonizing white men and colonized black women. And there was certainly a lot of action, whether between sheets and consensual or violent in the form of rape. The colonial everyday was certainly characterized by a range of sexual behaviors, ranging from delicate erotic desire, acted out consensually, to the brutal appropriation of indigenous women. Arguably, most settlers, traders, merchants, officials even, were having it off with indigenous women. Leave it at that for now. Safe to say that this would be the real reason for the small number of women killed in the first days of the war. We have no information whatsoever of how indigenous women in consensual relationships with white men in the settlements and on the farms with white men fared.
Sorry, yes, I'm opening too many cans of worms. That is somehow one of the scourges of journalists.
Yeah.
We journalists being nosy, wanting to know everything.
Yes, you're right. Tom, you're just being true to yourself and your calling. Let me continue. Where missionaries and their families were caught off guard by the outbreak of this conflict, they were guided and guarded to safety by members of the parishes they had established among OvaHerero, and which were part of this ward, obviously. They led them, accompanied these right through the battlefields east of Okahandja, around Okanjira and Oshizatsu. The Rhenish missionaries August Kuhlmann and Wilhelm Eich with their families are examples. And anyway, let us finally get back to some narrative of the events as they unfolded once the war had started.
Yes, I agree, Wolfram. Just let's get back to that point.
Yes, back to the actual story. Okahandja had been fortified with a few casualties during the first day, probably because those venturing out of the fort had not really understood how serious the situation was. An attempt at sending reinforcements from Windhoek was unsuccessful, with a skirmish at the crossing of the Osona River. The missionaries were not considered part of the war, and therefore could remain unharmed in their abode. An offer to seek shelter in the fort was declined by them. Windhoek was put on high alert on January 12th, but was neither besieged nor attacked. The railroad tracks and the telegraph lines were gradually restored. As Omaruru had been forewarned, it was fortified. Okumbaha, as an outpost of Omaruru, was fortified and garrisoned with a few civilians, mainly to keep resident allied Damara on the German side. Oshimbingwe was attacked and laid waste on January 23rd. However, it was retained by German civilians. Chobabis, with its outposts Witvley, Epokiro, Aminuis and Oas, and Grootfontein, with its filials Waterberg, Oshituo, Namutoni, and Otavi, were besieged and or attacked, but not overrun. Namutoni was attacked by a force of Andonga Ovambo in an attempt to take advantage of the weakness of the German forces. At the time, there were only 8 soldiers at Fort Namutoni. Karibib, Uchu, and Swakopmund had been alerted, yet were not attacked. Okazeva, Oshizeva, Oshiaenena, Oshizasu, and Oshizonjupa, mission stations of the Rhenish Mission Society, had to be abandoned and were destroyed subsequently. The missionaries were allowed to flee to the safe havens provided by their colleagues. I mentioned this earlier.
Sure, I remember we talked about this in one of our German podcast episodes, right? Sorry, I have interrupted you again.
The military forces that had been marched out to deal with Bundeswehr were immediately returned to Hereroland. Captain Victor Franke arrived with the troops in Windhoek on January 19th. His arrival turned the fortunes of war in favor of the Germans. Relief expeditions dispatched in an easterly direction stabilized the military situation around Windhoek, as OvaHerero military units were dispersed towards Hoffnung, Hohewarte, and Kapsfam. Sadly, I have not yet been able to establish the OvaHerero names of these places. Okahandja was retaken on January 27th. Omaruru was relieved on February 4th in a heavy battle where OvaHerero suffered serious losses, and Oshimbingwe was relieved on February the 15th.
Yes, Wolfram, quite some battles, but how did the Germans then eventually succeeded?
Military reinforcements from Germany, which were immediately mobilized, arrived speedily to assist with the recovery of the besieged locations. The cruiser Habicht, which had been refueling at Cape Town, arrived at Swakopmund on January 18th with 80 troops. In early February, 800 Marines arrived from Germany with an automatic cannon and a railway construction detachment. These contingents of newly arrived soldiers were incorporated into the existing military structure in German Southwest Africa, and detachments were reorganized. The main detachment in German Hauptabteilung was stationed in Okahandja A detachment for the East, Ostabteilung, had its seat in Windhoek, its task being to defend the area east of Windhoek, and the detachment for the West, Westabteilung, had its quarters in Amaruru. By the end of the first phase of this war, all the important places had been successfully regained. The Germans were in control again and more or less increasingly.
We talked earlier about the preparedness of the Germans, yet their speedy recapturing of the settlements and preliminary, though not final submission of OvaHerero astounds and needs some deliberation. You pointed at something in this line earlier.
Tom, this would be the juncture to share a few thoughts about different kinds of warfare in January 1904 and to reflect on the question why the German forces, who were few, managed to find their feet remarkably soon, and in the face of an adversary of many, many more fighters, an overwhelming number of OvaHerero combatants. So, let us look into particularly OvaHerero, if not indigenous warfare tactics and strategies. Indigenous warfare tactics and strategies are best encapsulated in this OvaHerero idiomatic expression: Umbika Yahua Umuhunga. Einen Hasen schießt man nicht von vorn. In English, don't shoot a hare from the front, meaning, if you want to kill the hare, shoot it from behind. One OvaHerero with whom I shared questions about this issue summarized it by saying, we OvaHerero, we hit and run. This martial philosophy is called tribal warfare among warfare strategists. European, rather colonial warfare is termed imperial warfare. The most obvious characteristic of tribal warfare is its constituent element of surprise. Raids to capture cattle, supplies and women, and to kill as many opponent warriors as possible and destroy their settlements are conducted with an ambush-like tactic. Maximum harm with the least damage is inflicted thus. And, most importantly, flight is part of this strategy, a central element. Also, secession is a defining element. As soon as the aim of an ambush has been reached, further action is ceased, withdrawal happens. When the OvaHerero attacked Germans in January 1904, their timing was perfect. As the military had been marched off, their defenses were left vulnerable, or rather deemed to be. Nearly all the farmers and traders in Herero were killed. Their houses were destroyed, and their shops were raided. In short, all the necessities of war, tribal war that is, such as guns, ammunition and supplies, were taken. The OvaHerero had seized the moment, and they retained the upper hand during the first weeks of the war, and sort of withdrew, ceded.
Terrific. Let's hear how imperial warfare panned out in this situation. Is this not called something like asymmetrical warfare? I'm just asking myself.
Yes, asymmetrical warfare it is. To fully understand the nature of this asymmetry, we need to figure out how German warfare, imperial warfare, was different. This type of warfare is based on the availability of vastly superior resources and infrastructure such as soldiers, weaponry, railways and ships, all of which the Germans had in abundance. The standing and professional German army, that is, in Germany, had circa 795,000 trained soldiers. Hundreds, if not thousands, of these soldiers could be immediately mobilized to fight in German Southwest Africa. They were generally unmarried and therefore without immediate family responsibilities and received regular pay. The circa 20,000 German soldiers who were on active duty during colonial wars in German Southwest Africa amounted, and this is sort of a figure we have to keep in mind, amounted to 0.25% of the imperial army, the Reichswehr, the German army in Germany. In terms of numbers, this was a negligible quantity, particularly when compared to a tribal situation. A question that arises here is why the numerically superior OvaHerero with 3,000 guns did not succeed to rout the Germans at Kauendeka with their 1,500 guns. These figures are contested. But let's work on them. The generally better quality of the arms of the Germans as compared to that mustered by OvaHerero, worn out, underserviced and old-fashioned, certainly would have played a major role. Yet, this does not fully explain the resounding successes of imperial armies, albeit often only after huge losses. And, let me add, these figures are quite contested, as I said already. The most unique feature of any imperial army is discipline. The colonial army's troops were highly structured and tightly organized, and troop members were extremely obedient. The soldiers were imbued with an absolute sense of submission and orderliness. Strict command structures were relentlessly drilled into the soldiers, and any insubordination during this process was sanctioned with draconian measures. As a result, military units that were trained in this manner could be relied on in the most adverse and stressful conditions. Absconding would endanger everybody, and individual soldiers could always, under all circumstances, depend on their fellow soldiers in all respects. Deserters were immediately court-martialed and executed. In tribal armies, fighters were on their own, and they operated without any training, centralized command structure, or proper instruction. The act of taking flight of groups or single combatants was considered normal. Once they understood their inferior position, escape was considered a tactical option.
Wolfram, let me briefly summarize what I have understood about asymmetric warfare. The difference in the Germans' imperial warfare was that it was based on vastly superior resources and infrastructure in terms of soldiers, weapons, and mobility, and the German troops were highly structured and tightly organized. And tribal armies are mostly operated without a centralized command structure nor a proper training. But as you mentioned, it does not fully explain the success of the German troops.
Yes, aptly summarized.
Yes, I think this calls for an extra podcast with more time to focus on this topic. And as we have, seemingly, already and again indulged in information overload, stay tuned and join us for a next episode on the next phases of this gruesome war. So let's rather wrap up.
Indeed. There are very many things to say about the next phase of this war. Good idea to continue this in the next episode of this series of Namibian history podcasts then. And as always, I need to have the last word. Ha! This work happens not in my brain exclusively. Much rather, it comes into being in the spaces between myself and the many friends and colleagues, you, Tom, being the most important here. So, thank you to everybody. Particularly, Erika and Festus Munjua have to be mentioned in this regard. Claudio Suhura Riruaco had many a good idea and upbeat mental handout. A special thank you goes to Wilfried Lala Salenke, further to Ellen Thormann and Olaf Skupin. Matthias Häusler needs to be acknowledged. His groundbreaking work on some of the issues raised is obviously relevant. Catherine Haywood's enthusiasm to make this work language-wise, well, she earns unfathomably in immaterial times, that is. Most importantly, our listeners' feedback is what keeps us going. The positive and felicitative conversations with many a listener are gratefully recognized. Thank you and stay tuned.
Yes, Wolfram, you mentioned the last word, but I cannot fully allow you this. I still have to add something. You mentioned the many people already that giving some input and are behind this podcast, but I have to thank you again, Wolfram, because you again prepared this content so well. I've learned so much again, and I know how much effort you put in, and I just wanted to thank you also again. Thank you to the listeners as well, and I think, tune in again.